Hello, and welcome to episode 12 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's episode, we have Dr. Michael Ruse, the Lucyle T. Werkmeister Professor and Director of the History and Philosophy of Science program at Florida State University. Michael is a philosopher of science who specializes in the philosophy of biology and is well known for his work on the relationship between science and religion, the creation-evolution controversy, and the demarcation problem within science. Michael was a key witness for the plaintiff in the 1981 test case McLean versus Arkansas of the state law permitting the teaching of creation science in the Arkansas school system. The federal judge ruled that the state law was unconstitutional. Michael has sought to reconcile science and religion, a position which has brought him into conflict with Richard Dawkins and Pharyngula science blogger P.Z. Myers. Michael has also made several criticisms of prominent figures labeled in the public sphere as new atheists. For example, according to Michael, new atheists do the side of science a grave disservice, a disservice to scholarship. He has made the claim that Dawkins would fail any introductory philosophy or religion course. He has also said the God delusion makes him ashamed to be an atheist, and referred to new atheists as a bloody disaster, while his fellow atheists have likened him to Neville Chamberlain, the pusillanimous appeaser, and a clueless gobshite for his defense of religion and religious believers. Needless to say, Michael has been and continues to be an important figure in the philosophy of science, and it was a great pleasure to chat with him and to learn about his story. And I do hope you enjoy this interview, as I liken it to be one of our most entertaining episodes on the podcast. Thus, without further ado, let's bring in Michael. Let's start back in the beginning. So Michael, where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in England.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in England. I was born in 1940. In fact, I was just saying to somebody yesterday, very shortly after I was born, our house was bombed by the Germans.
Oh, my gosh.
And I went away to boarding school in York. And then I left England in 1962 on a scholarship and went to Canada. And I lived in Canada till 2000, at which point, placed in compulsory retirement, I moved down to the States and to Florida State, where I've been ever since.
Well, I appreciate the World War history here. I'm really curious though. So, at what point? So you grew up in England, and at what point did you leave for boarding school?
At 13, no, pretty common in England. I mean, I went to school with boys who'd been at boarding school since they were 7 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
But the usual age in England is about 13 to 18 or 19.
Sure.
It's a very strange system, getting rid of your kids at that stage of their lives. But that's very much, it was. I don't know how much it is now, but it was a very common middle-class pattern when I grew up.
Okay. What did your parents do?
My father was a civil servant, and then he became a school bursar, school accountant. And my mother was a school teacher, but she died when I was 13, just as when I went away to boarding school. So,
okay. And but both.
I came from a family of educators, and when I was a kid, everybody would say to me, "Oh, well, you're going to be a school teacher when you grow up," and I would say, "Absolutely not."
Yeah.
But I feel exactly the same way now. The thought of a teacher fills me with horror.
So what did you, let's say, if you can recall back to boarding school days, or what did you want to be when you grew up? What were you thinking in terms of profession?
I don't think I really had any ideas. I think at one point I certainly thought of medicine, but it's hard to imagine. But I grew up in the 1950s, and frankly, medicine wasn't a very high-profile subject at that time. Everybody wanted to do physics and chemistry, and medicine, I'm not joking, was basically for people who couldn't handle concepts. I mean, I'm inclined to think medicine still is that. I mean, I'm not sure that a lot of medicine is very conceptual. I mean, I'm not saying there's no medicine which is conceptual, which isn't conceptual, which is conceptual, but it seems to me that a lot of medicine is much more knowing the facts and also, being good with personalities. And it wasn't, as I say, it was not at all a high-profile thing in the 50s. And so, whereas, in the 60s or 70s, all the bright kids wanted to be doctors. But it wasn't that way at all. It was for kids who really couldn't do real subjects in medicine, or geography, or Spanish, or woodwork.
So how did people, or how was the context of the 1950s? What do you think was like driving folks to be interested primarily like physics, chemistry? It was all the rage.
I mean, don't forget, we're at the time of the Cold War. We're at 1957 is the time of Sputnik, and a lot of things like that. So it's certainly the case that physics was really much more high profile in many respects. And physics, chemistry, those sciences, much more high profile in those days than perhaps they are now. But certainly that was what we all wanted to be. We all wanted to do physics and chemistry. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm atypical, but I think a lot of us really, it was not a subject during my teens where we'd sit down and spend a lot of time wondering about what we were going to do. We had to do the courses, and in England, you have to decide on which areas you're going to do pretty early. But hey, there were kids who, when I was at school, who knew that they were going to go into their father's business, or particularly kids whose fathers were doctors. That tended to be very much something which is passed on, because apart from anything else in those days, people would have a practice which would be worth money, and they'd want to leave it to their children. So, as I say, I had schoolmates who were certainly destined pretty much for what they were going to do, and I think, for the last 50 years they've done it, but most of us weren't even really thinking in those terms.
Sure. Okay, so what were you thinking about in the school age terms? Sorry?
Girls,
yeah. Yeah, you're coming of age. Yeah, of course.
What else does one think about when you're
that's certainly up there in the mental space.
I mean, if you ask me, of course, particularly at boarding schools, sports tend to be a big thing, and they were at mine. Not that I was particularly good at it. I mean, the other thing my school was very good was things like music and drama, and this was something which certainly, if anything, has stayed with me all of my life. So those were certainly things which were of importance, but I don't think that one thought. I mean, there were differences. I mean, there was no drug culture in those days, for instance. I've seen my children grow up, and I was very much aware of the fact that even if there weren't hard drugs, that pot was very readily available, and those sort of things, which of course I think made for a somewhat different culture. But so that wasn't an issue. Drinking wasn't a big issue with us until we got to the university age, because of being away at boarding school, you don't really have those sort of facilities. I mean, we didn't grow up as quickly. I mean, apart from anything else, in England, you have to be 17, or you had to be 17 to get a driver's license. Whereas my driver's license is at 15. And then, of course, in England, there was a pretty strict driving test, which certainly wasn't for my kids. So most of us weren't driving or anything like that. I mean, I didn't get my first car until I was in my 20s. I mean, it was a slower culture, let's put it that way.
Okay. You said like music and drama, were those subjects you participated in? Did you play an instrument or act in a play? Or
I sound like an awful flop, but I wasn't really very good at those things. I mean, looking back now, I see that my real abilities are with writing.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I was doing physics and chemistry, like everyone else, and math. So didn't have a huge encouragement on that, but I did a lot of reading. And as I say, I certainly think the child is the father of the man. I mean, I don't find at all surprising now that I spent a lot of time writing. When I look back on who I was earlier on, that's the way it is.
Sure. Okay.
I think it's interesting that now I want to write books really rather than articles. I mean, I write articles, but really I'm much happier writing books. And I don't find that a surprise because I grew up as a child reading an awful lot, a lot of fiction. Swallows and Amazons, and then Neville Shute, and a lot of that. Then getting into people like Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene. As a novelist, I read a lot of D.H. Lawrence as a teenager, and haven't been able to look at him since. As I say, looking back now, I don't find it at all surprising that I write, nor do I find it surprising that I want to write books rather than articles. It's the way my mind thinks, always has done.
So, yeah, I'd be interested to return to, and maybe we can think about some of those books that you're writing a little bit later on. I'm interested to hear about, what is it you like writing about books that more so than articles?
I've never been very comfortable as an analytic philosopher because analytic philosophy, I think, lends itself much more to the article than the book. I mean, they're both enough as articles. The whole book, it's tedium, squared. But that's never been the kind of thinker that I am at that sort of level.
Sure. So you went to boarding school. What was up next? Where did you go on to next?
Well, I went on to university. I didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. I went to University of Bristol, which is a good red brick university. And I made one of the biggest mistakes in my life after marrying my first wife. That was to think I was good enough to do mathematics. So I went to do mathematics.
You didn't think you were good?
I think on the second day there, I was a good high school math, but I wasn't a university mathematician. And more interestingly, in a way, is I didn't particularly want to be. In England, particularly in those days, it was a 3-year degree. You were accepted by a department rather than by the university. So you pretty much did the subject of what North Americans would call your major. So when I went to university, I mean, no kidding. I mean, the fare was 4 math courses a week for 3 years. I mean, there were nothing, not even physics. I mean, let alone taking a course in literature. I mean, that's one of the reasons, again, why I've always been much happier teaching in North America, where I think at the undergraduate level, you get a much broader perspective. Now, I mean, the argument the other way was going to high school in England was much more intense than the kind of holiday camps that high schools often tend to be in North America. I mean, I see my 3 kids went through Lincoln High School here in Tallahassee. And, I mean, basically it was a bit like it was a bit like Disney,
It's almost more on social development, I think, than
from that. It was much more. I always felt it was much more of a social occasion than an academic situation. So, I mean, at one level we were very trained up in our area. So I realized pretty early on at university that I didn't want to do mathematics, and I discovered, to my surprise, that they had an out, and I wasn't the only one who'd ever found that. Well, I could change to math and philosophy after my first year, which I did, so I didn't have to do so much math. And the only criterion I needed to get into the philosophy side was having done O-level Latin, which I had done. And so I was off and running, and I switched, but I couldn't get rid of the math.
So was philosophy the only other intermediate path you could have taken, or is there something that drew you to that?
Yes. I want to stress that I didn't go into philosophy because I was attracted to philosophy.
Sure.
I mean, because I was escaping from mathematics.
That's fair.
I say I'm not quite sure whether memory is right. The first philosophy course I took was Descartes' Meditations. And 15 minutes into the class, I realized that was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, which I have done. It was magical. I mean, it was just, here's a guy wondering about whether he's awake or asleep, whether there are objects behind you when you're not looking at them, whether an evil demon could, make everything that you think false. I mean, as my wife says, people go through that phase and get on with it, but I didn't. And as soon as I started philosophy, I realized that this was it. So again, it wasn't really a question of choosing a subject or a career. It's just I wanted to do philosophy. The other thing was, and we didn't mention this, when I was a child, my father was a conscientious objector in the war. And after the war, he and my mother joined the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers. And so I grew up in a very intense Christian background. I mean, it's not, because Quakers are rather funny Christians in the sense that they don't have ministers and they don't have churches. But it was very intense. I mean, we weren't Unitarians. I mean, we really believed in the divinity of Christ. And the boarding school I went to was a Quaker school, although I found it a lot less spiritual than my early years. So I think that was I don't think I went into philosophy because I had a Quaker background. But I think when I went into philosophy, having had a Quaker background where one was encouraged to think and argue for oneself, I mean, after the war, it wasn't easy to defend pacifism, and we weren't expected to just swallow the line. We were expected to think about these things. So when I took up philosophy, it felt very comfortable in that sense that it was what I'd grown up with. And at about the same time, I think my belief in the existence of God faded. It wasn't a road to Damascus experience in reverse, in the sense that I didn't, read David Hume and say, now it's all revealed, God is bullshit.
Sure.
It was much more what they used to say in the 19th century, a parting of friends, where basically people realized that their religious paths had taken them in different ways. And, it was a matter of sadness and regret, but it's inevitable, but not necessarily something which involved, as I say, lightning and thunder coming from above and, this is my beloved that I'm now rejecting forevermore, or something of that nature. It was all a package deal.
Yeah, so, coming from, I suppose, a Quaker boarding school where spirituality was, or it wasn't quite maybe as strong as upbringing, how was your experience with other students, with other faculty, in terms of your religious beliefs? I mean, was this something that folks talked about actively, or was it?
Yeah, don't forget, in England after the war, I mean, the church, the state schools, we had religious instruction, Church of England. I mean, there's never been, like in America, the separation of church and state, although in many respects, I think England is a more secular society. I mean, clearly separation of church and state in America is a rather fraught business, isn't it? I mean, we're seeing right now with the present administration.
Yep.
The first thing the guy does is ban abortion as much as he can. Well, that's not a scientific decision. That's a religious decision. So separation of church and state in America is official, but it's more honored in the word than in the practice, I think. Whereas in England, although the Church of England was part of the fabric of society, in many respects the whole issue of religion was a lot less fraught. Of course, we all knew that God was English and spoke English and was a member of the Church of England. But let's get on with it.
Yeah.
So it was. I grew up as a Quaker. I had a friend who was a Roman Catholic, but it was never, as I say, a matter of intense whatever like that. I mean, I'd go to Quaker youth camps in the summer and those sort of things. But religion was not in that way. I mean, we had social issues like to do with capital punishment. But again, I don't look back upon it as, let's say in America, you have over gay rights. I mean, gays are a big issue then. Should they be sent to prison? But it wasn't, again, I never felt that the society was tearing itself apart on these things or on capital punishment. A lot of differences, yes, but not at that kind of level. That kind of level. There were, those weren't the things which, in that sort of way, troubled us at that level. And that's my attitude now. Is that's why I could never be a new atheist. Is because religion or non-religion for me has never been evangelical in that sort of way.
Yeah, it's kind of, there's certainly the case. I mean, that definitely is the culture of academia, is that the new atheist is particularly kind of obnoxious, to be honest.
Right. Well, I mean, both sides. I mean, they're fanatics. They take no prisoners. Anybody who doesn't agree with them, completely and utterly is wrong and condemned to eternal damnation. And I never felt that way about. I mean, I'm pretty confident in my non-belief, but It's never been evangelical in that sort of way.
I like the way you put that, especially as characterizing as like an evangelical atheist is something you see more and more. And I think people are starting to be a little bit. There's a little bit more understanding or charity toward other folks' beliefs.
Eric runs that blog, what is it? Why evolution is true? When he's talking about evolutionary theory, I think he's terrific. But then he gets onto religion, and in the old days in philosophy, we used to talk about these as blicks. A mindset that nothing is ever going to change, and that's how these people are.
Yeah. Well, I mean, well, maybe we can get back to this. This is interesting. So, working at university, you're taking philosophy courses. What kind of philosophy were you into?
Well, I mean, naturally, as a Quaker, I was interested in ethics. Oh. And as I say, there were issues which were going on, like in England, not civil rights so much, but capital punishment was a big issue, and gay rights was a big issue. So there were all of these, those sorts of issues which were going on. I mean, pacifism. But I mean, honestly and truly, when I started doing philosophy around 1960, ethics was so unbelievably tedious and boring. All with RM hair and prescriptivism and, and the worst kind of, the only moral example anybody could agree on was whether or not you should return your library books on time. And, it was tedium, beyond compare. So I moved more to philosophy of science, having done A-levels in physics and no, I didn't do chemistry. I did math and physics, math and higher math. So I got that background, and as it happens, there were some good people writing about the philosophy of science, people like Braithwaite, R.B. Braithwaite in England, and of course Nagel and Hempel in America. And they were good philosophers, and they took the science seriously, and they were interesting. One always felt that they were, and because Popper was there too. They were interesting, humane people. I mean, something with Popper. Popper was a god-awful human being. He was a dreadful.
What was so bad about Popper?
He was an appalling person. But he stood for integrity and truth at a time when the world, the 30s and 40s, at a time when the world needed people to stand up and speak up for integrity and truth. So I've always had an immense admiration and respect for Popper, for what he stood for. As I say, quite apart. I mean, Popper he was so insecure. He wanted groupies. He was like Trump. No, he wasn't. Nobody is like Trump. But,
that's a strong comparison. But I see what you mean. Like he liked the fandom of his work. Yeah,
to his psychological needs. And I've never been. I mean, that's one of the reasons I could never be a Christian. Is I can't worship other human beings. Maybe it's all Oedipal. I didn't get on with my father or something. But as I say, I've always respected Popper hugely. But I also respected people like Nagel and Hempel. And, so doing philosophy of science, as far as I was concerned, was being in the company men, and they were mainly men. There was Mary Hesse coming along, but people I felt of integrity that one could admire, and I still feel that way, even though I don't do much of that kind of philosophy myself anymore. But I always felt that way, and I do now.
So who did you admire at that time? Who, like, coming up, learning about different philosophers of science, maybe this might bleed over into your graduate years. Which figures did you admire or tend to like?
I say, and I got into the field. I mean, there obviously Richard R.B. Braithwaite in England, scientific explanation, and then Nagel's the Science came out, I think, in 1961, the year after I got a copy of it very early. I do know that. And I do remember reading that, not immediately, but over the next 3 or 4 years. And as I read it, it seemed to me to be a work of great integrity. And Hempel was writing, again, his little book on the philosophy of science was 1966. But again, as I say, these were the people that I read. And admired immensely.
Oh, great!
You'll notice that for me, and this isn't prissy. I've always taken what we say the moral side of doing philosophy to be very important. Whilst weren't writing directly on morality, I feel, and I do now, that they regarded science not as sacred, but as a tremendously important aspect of human creative spirit. Along with a Mozart symphony or something like that. In other words, I always felt that these people weren't just doing philosophy of science as a job, but they were doing they really felt that there was something there of great, as I say, moral work. I mean, I know technology can be used for ill, but I don't think we weren't even thinking about technology as such. I think that these were people who looked upon the discoverers of the scientists as being, things of the value, let us say, of a great opera, Così fan tutte, or something like that, or what should we say, Bleak House. And I felt that, I still feel that. And so I felt that I was in the company then of people that I wanted to be like. And I've never, reading Descartes, I've never felt that philosophy is a job. I've always felt that philosophy is something. I've always felt, I'm a terrible snob. I've always felt that the most important thing that one can do with one's life. Like everybody else. I look down on sociology and education, you know what I mean? But I admire people who are good with classics or good at particle physics. But at a level, it's not philosophy.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's certainly not. It's certainly, there's certainly different fields, and I hadn't thought about that so much as treating philosophy as more of an activity, an engaging exercise. It's something fun to do as opposed to a job.
A while there, in my 30s, when I got very much involved in the history of science, I also thought for a while that I might move over to doing history of science. I had a joint appointment in the history department, but I realized after 3 or 4 years of doing that it wasn't enough, that I was always wanting to come back to, well, what does it mean? I mean, as I just wrote recently, I've always had this feeling that doing history is great fun, but it's not a full-time occupation for grown-ups.
I think I like that.
Tell the historians of science in your group.
It's not a full-time. Yeah, I think I'll probably leave that out, but
it's not. But as I say, I don't think doing history on its own is not a subject for grown-ups.
No, sure.
It's a full-time occupation. A little bit like golf, I imagine, although I've never played golf in my life. But,
Sure. So you studied at Bristol, and then I see you went over to Canada to study at McMaster. Is that right?
I did.
That's great. Yeah. So was it
the blue? I've written about this in a blog actually. That as the blue that summer, I ended up with a rather bad degree because I didn't do very math and didn't do very well on what I did do. Then out of the blue, my professor of philosophy, a man called Stephen Kerner, wrote to me and said, well, we've just had this offer from a place I've never heard of, a country I'm not sure I know where it is, in Canada. And we tried to find it on the map, but we couldn't. But he said, well, they're offering, a year's support to do an MA. And he said, if you want me to write a letter for you, I'll do that. And 6 weeks later, I was on the Empress of England going down the Clyde on the way to Canada. And in those days, it was easier to get the equivalent of a green card than to become get a student visa. So I got my, landed immigrant status, they call it in Canada. I stayed.
Yeah. How did you like it?
It was cold.
A big change from England. Yeah, I imagine.
Which I look back on. One was I never, ever, after I went to Canada, I went back to England to do my PhD and I spent sabbaticals there, but I never, ever had the desire, inclination, or thought to go back to England on a permanent basis. It never crossed my mind that might be an option. And looking back now, I don't say. Looking back now, I didn't do medicine, and I sometimes think, what if I'd done medicine? I'm sure I would have gotten into something like bioethics. I would have been driven crazy by being a GP, but I could see doing something conceptual in medicine, like, as I say, bioethics, which I think is a lot better than it was 20 years ago. I think it's now a very different. And I could see being, I got into philosophy of biology, I could see getting into philosophy of medicine or something like that, which I would have done. So I won't say I regret it, but I could see that as a path not taken. Whereas staying in Canada and not going back to England, I've never seen it as a path not taken. If I had a job offer in America or something, I could see going to America. I've gone to America much earlier than I did, but again, I did, and that's how it went.
Sure. So what was it about that convinced you? That England was, you were in the right space, or that going back to England wasn't something you wanted to do.
Well, I say, it was partly that, partly Canada. There were aspects of Canada. If you ask somebody from Britain in Canada in the early 60s, whatever their background was, and quite often they were people a bit older than I was who'd come with families, and you'd say, well, what's the bad thing about living in Canada is the bloody awful winter. Okay, we agree on that. But what's the good thing about Canada? The first thing that any Brit immediately said was no class system. Immediately. The first thing that anybody from Britain immediately no class system. Now, there is a bit of a class system, to be honest. And there are circles within circles, and that's nothing in England. And I taught University of Guelph, which was a provincial university, and there's space up to it. University of Toronto is a much bigger and better in many respects place, but I never ever felt any. I was at a red brick university rather than Oxford or Cambridge, as you did in England. It just didn't. It wasn't that sort of place. It really wasn't. The whole atmosphere was completely different in that respect, and you were much more respected for what you did and how you did it and those sort of things. And to that day, I'm eternally grateful. Eternally grateful to have lived in Canada rather than in Britain. Although, as I say, I love to go back to England. I enjoy it immensely. I've got a kid doing an MA at UCL at the moment.
Oh, great.
It's just the kind of country it is.
Sure.
And we see this now. What did England do last year? Brexit. That nasty xenophobic side to the which is really, Christ. Nuts. Whereas, not that America's much better just at the moment, but at least there's never been that sort of way. I don't say Canada's perfect. I think the behavior towards native people has been atrocious on occasion. But it's not the same kind of atmosphere. Anyhow.
No, sure, yeah. No, I'd heard a random...
The other thing is Canada is a secular society in a way that America is not. I mean, you've got the Anglican Church, you've got the Catholics and all of that, but I mean, abortion has been legal in Canada for donkey's years. Yeah.
Yeah. So you went from, let's see, you studied in, did you go back to Bristol?
Well, I went to Rochester for a couple of years and really screwed up there.
Oh, really? What happened in Rochester?
Those sort of things. But also, it was something which was only gradually growing on me, is that I wanted to do philosophy, but I didn't want to do analytic philosophy. I mean, not that I've been particularly drawn to continental philosophy, although, you know, I'm supervising a student at the moment who's doing a dissertation on Nietzsche, so I can handle Nietzsche. I'm not sure I can handle Heidegger.
Sure.
But I think it was only gradually realizing that I didn't want to do straight analytic philosophy, and that on the one hand, I was always much more interdisciplinary. I was much more interested, as I discovered, in moving across fields. And I think the other thing was, the other thing was, as I say, over the years, for various reasons, I've gotten into the history of ideas with a philosophical lens. And I see that's much more me. I'll give you an example. Just today, actually, yesterday I was contacted by a publisher, Routledge, write a blurb on the book, collection of articles on the philosophy of biology. And they sent me several of the articles. So I was reading them. I was reading them actually before you called. And one of them was by a woman called Karen Neander, I think, on philosophy of biology. And it's an article, it's 8,000 words on the philosophy of biology. And it's a very tightly, and I want to praise it. I mean, it's a very good overview on teleology, you know, forward thinking in the philosophy of biology. And I did some of that way back when. Now, I myself have just written a book on the same topic called On Purpose that's coming out with Princeton later this year. And it's completely night and day in the sense that I have a paragraph about the sort of stuff that she's doing. A not very polite paragraph where I quote Belloc as it, you know, the chief detective Henry King was chewing little bits of string. At last he swallowed some which tied itself in ugly knots inside. And I say, that's how I regard analytic philosophy. It ended up killing Henry King in the end.
Yeah.
Philosophy of biology or teleology. It just seemed to me that sort of stuff. Whereas the book I've written, you know, my first chapter's on Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics, and then my next chapter's on St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and then my next chapter's on Robert Boyle and Immanuel Kant. Even before I get to Darwin, it's not how I do philosophy.
Well, I'm very excited to hear about this new book. When's it coming out?
It's coming out, I hope, this fall. I mean, I haven't done the copy of it. But of course, I've got a lot of Darwin stuff in it as well, but presumably we're going to get to that, where I discovered Darwin, the philosophical importance of Darwinism. So there you go. Go on.
Okay, so you went from Rochester. I meant, did you go to study at Rochester and then find your way back to Bristol for a little bit, or?
Well, I went to do a PhD, and I left after 2 years with 7 incompletes and 1 B.
Oh.
As I say, I think the thing I learned from Rochester was partly what I didn't want to do, but also I think I saw people like Keith Lehrer and a man called Jim Conman, who's been dead for some years now, in action, being very professional about the field, about trying to publish, reading stuff, wanting to get published, and that sort of thing. Although I not only didn't do any of that at the time and was kind of incapable of doing that, obviously by osmosis, that I absorbed that. And I've been eternally grateful to them for what I call their professionalism in that respect, and realizing that if I was going to be part of the part of the field. I wanted to be a player and not just observer. And that was going to be terribly important to me. And that it was going to take a lot of work. And as I say, it was also going to take, and I think I learned this, or I realized this, that you're going to get a lot of rejection in our business. And people say to me now, oh, it's easy for you, Mike, you've got a thick skin. And I say, no, nobody's got a thick skin.
No.
It's just some of us learn to live with our thin ones. And I did that early on, and that was a tremendous lesson. I don't know how much I got from Rochester, but I certainly saw that, and I've always felt that that was something I really did imbibe from them as the years in future years. So in one respect, in many respects, I've been a lot more grateful to my time there than I felt at the time. I think that's true. In fact, I had a little mini conference with 3 of the people I was in school with there, who have gone on to have respectable without being outstanding careers. And we talked about these sorts of things. And of course, everybody's amazed that, I mean, I'm not showing off now, that somebody was so inadequate as I, nevertheless, within 20 years have got a Guggenheim.
Well, I'm very impressed that you're so forthcoming about this. It's inspiring for those.
Yeah, to be perfectly, totally immodest. I knew I got a higher IQ than anybody else there, but I knew I was totally incapable of expressing it. I mean, that sounds a lot more immodest.
That's fine.
But it's the sort of thing. I mean, I asked myself, why was it that of all the students there, and some of them are doing really well and have gone on to have good careers, and yet I was the only one to get a Guggenheim. Now, why was that? And I asked myself that, and I want to understand. I mean, clearly, as I say, there's no question that it's not just a question of IQ. I always say it's a question of having a nose for a problem and being able to work hard, but also having that sort of feeling you're going to knock on a sodding door until they open it. And I've always been that way.
Yeah. Oh, so you mentioned being grateful for learning of how to be a player as opposed to an observer. How do you, and it sounds to me like learning to live with one's thin skin is one way. What are some other ways that you've come to learn to how to be a player in this field as opposed to an observer?
It's going to be hard work. And as I say, the creative thing, go back to the hard work. I think, I keep moving across, decades, but these are all important things. You see, I grew up after the war in England, lower middle class, not working class. I mean, we always had a car. My mother was a teacher, so we always had rather more income than most. But it was my father left school at 14. My mother went to teachers training college rather than university. And there was something called the Butler Act, which was passed in 1944. And basically what it meant was bright kids could go to grammar school if they got 11 plus, and then go on to university. For the first time, people who, not the other side of the tracks, I don't mean welfare mothers, I mean people who certainly would not have been able to afford private education, who would not normally have, didn't have parents who were doctors or lawyers, but lower level people whose fathers were, clerks in the equivalent of Walmart or something like that. If the kids were bright, could go to get a good secondary education and get and go to college, university as we called it. And I was part of that group. But the thing was, one knew that it wasn't going to be handed to us on a plate, that it was going to be competitive, and you had to work unbelievably hard to get it. I was taught, particularly my mother was, as I say, Chinese tiger mothers had nothing on my mother. Very loving. They were Quakers. They were very loving. But life was a job. The power of talents has always been the biggest one for me, even now. the Lord, that I don't believe in, gives you talent, doesn't expect you to put them in the ground. And I've always taken that tremendously seriously. Mm-hmm. And so after I left Rochester and got as one could in those days, with 65, and University of Guelph was just starting. It was built on the agricultural college. They hired 18 people in philosophy in 2 years. I mean, think of it. 18 people in philosophy. They won't hire 18 people in the next 50 years.
No. So was this the program just starting? It must have been.
Come in and what we'd call adjunct. And so I got a job as an adjunct. Mm-hmm. And, 2 semesters later, they said, Mike, you're obviously, we'll give you a job. You've got to go and get a PhD, but we'll give you a job.
Oh, okay.
They did in those days. And I've been eternally grateful to that. But I once I got a job, responsibility, and was responsible for preparing classes and
mm-hmm.
had even a little bit of money in my pocket, so I could buy some decent clothes. It made all the difference. But as I say to people, I didn't change. I reverted to what I had been. Always thought that. I mean, people say, "Oh God, you work so hard." What I say, well, I didn't when I was at university because I think I was depressed, lonely,
sure.
not doing the fields that appealed to me, didn't have a girlfriend, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
All of those sorts of things, and it was depressing. But as I say, when I changed and went back to working hard, it was very much a question of picking up what had been
mm-hmm.
rather than inventing what had never been.
Yeah, you very much mentioned as the child is of the man, and so tapping back into that sort of earlier understanding. There was some understanding you had as a kid that you needed to work hard.
I think so. The other
mm-hmm.
thing is death of my mother, which is the most important emotional thing.
Yeah, how was that? I mean, geez, at 13.
When I was 13, and one didn't realize it. My father married again, and it was very uncomfortable. Had a German stepmother. Still got her, actually. I mean, they're good friends now, but
it's tough to take. Yeah.
And but I look back on that, and obviously, to a great extent, I feel I'm living my life for 2, as it were. And I've always felt that I was, I've taught now for 50 years. Finally, I can look my long dead mother in the face and say, well, thank you. I think I've paid back what you gave to me. I think she'd be appalled at that, but at the same time, both of us would secretly agree I'm right.
What do you mean? I'm sorry. What do you mean living your life for 2?
You see, we were bright middle-class people, lower middle-class people,
mm-hmm.
after the war. For the first time, we really had this opportunity. It was there. My parents didn't have it, but they had it through their children. And by God, it was not going to be wasted. I'm one of many. I've got, friends that I've grown up with and know, who are very much in the same sort of situation and know exactly what I'm talking about. We're not the upper middle class. I mean, as it happens, I went away to boarding school because my father got a job and the Quaker, the Rowntrees, the Kit Kat people paid for my education. Mm-hmm. But I basically, that's veneer on the surface for me. And I'm much more a lower middle class grammar school type.
Mm-hmm. So you found your way, though, to the University of Guelph. And you taught there for...
It's an agri college. It's been around for 100 years. It wasn't agriculture, veterinary science,
mm-hmm.
and domestic science, home ed. And it was out in the country, 50 miles from Toronto. It had been offering Toronto degrees because Aggies have to have land.
Mm-hmm.
They have to have farms. So it was out there. Now, of course, it's much more industrialized, but it was out there. And they built it. Ontario was founded, I think, 5 new universities or 6 new universities 1 year. And so did America. Well, the whole thing was suddenly they were, the 60s when they were getting into higher education in a huge way. Like in England, they founded, Sussex, York, Lancaster, mm-hmm. Essex, Warwick. All of these, which have turned into be Bath, very good universities. But they founded, at Stirling, they founded, a pile of them in the 60s. And that's what Ontario was doing. And so I was one, along with places like York and Trent and Brock and Windsor being a Catholic college but turned into a regular university. So we were built on the back of the Aggie College with arts and sciences. And as I say, we basically never looked back. I mean, we were lucky, lots of land. We were close to, we had good connections because agriculture in Ontario there was a lot of government money coming in to fund various things. So we were lucky in that respect. But I was lucky to be there.
Yeah. So, I mean, you were there for quite a while. Is that correct? You taught
2000. I'd still be there if I'd been born a year or two younger.
Yeah.
Because I think it was the year after they abolished compulsory retirement, and I'd married a second time, and I got I'm facing retirement with 3 teenagers. Christ, man,
Wow. Yeah.
You need them.
So do you have any, favorite moments or stories from your time teaching at Guelph?
Well, except I found both of my wives in my classroom. That's a good start, isn't it?
Oh, well, that's certainly interesting stories.
I was a full professor. My second wife is a 19-year-old first-year undergraduate. How's that one?
Okay.
Now, 35 years. We've been married, I think, 32. So there you go.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations for the long and.
So it's difficult to top that one, isn't it?
Well, no, that's a good story. I mean, so you met you guys.
Okay, this question. One thing was, once I started work, I went back to Bristol and did my PhD in a year off because I only had to spend a year in residence.
Uh-huh.
I worked hard. I became a full professor within 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the then president wanted one. I think there were 2 of us. He was clamping down on too early promotions. In other words, he sent something out saying normally I would not expect anybody to become a full professor before they were 40, and he wanted a couple of examples of people he'd made full professor much earlier to show that his prohibition was not done on age as such, but on merit. And so he could use, which he did, and say, well, Ruse was only 33 and I made him a full professor, so it's not a question of age. And now I think looking back, they took a bit of a chance on me, but, again, within 3 or 4 years, every now and then taking a chance does pay dividends, and I did. I was very, very loyal. I never became chair. I never wanted that. And I do my share of this shit work, but I never much enjoyed it. And my colleague, one good thing was nobody was paid any more than anybody else. I mean, there was a bit of raise as you went up through the ranks, but I had colleagues when I left in 2000 who were still associate professors who were making as much money as I was. And it wasn't a matter of tenure. We were all paid pretty much the same on a scale, as they do in British universities. And I had a friend who went to New Zealand from Florida State 2 or 3 years after I arrived. He said the first year there, he said, I couldn't believe when money came up that we were not giving the high flyers a lot more money. He said within 2 years, I realized what a wonderful thing it was that we were all paid adequately and we were not spending our time being tense about who was getting more than others.
Yeah.
And it was fine. You see, the thing is, I did do a lot of traveling, and they towards the end, they cut down on my teaching load. And nobody resented that because they knew I was working. But at the same time, they knew I wasn't. I mean, I think they would have resented it if they'd known at the same time I was getting half as much money again as they were. I wasn't. And everybody felt pretty comfortable with that. The other thing was, they always knew that if there was something like a committee the presidential search committee, that they would not get on, but they could put my name forward and it would get on. I would do that. I did do that. So I sat on over the years, I sat on 2 or 3 committees like that, that they probably not have gotten on, but that I did get on, university-wide committees. And I did it conscientiously. And everybody knew that. And basically, everybody was very comfortable. So they did not put me in charge of library orders.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Sure.
undergraduate teaching.
Yeah. Okay, that's what I wasn't familiar with that, but it makes sense. Yeah.
It's true. I mean, you've got to have somebody in the department who does library orders.
Library orders, okay. Yeah, you do.
Not the person to do library orders.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I imagine now you have
Since we talk about these things,
Mm-hmm.
I not only did my share of undergraduate teaching, but I always taught first-year students, first and second-year students, very rarely third and fourth-year students, because I always have loved teaching first and second-year students. And they appreciated that, because often these were big classes.
Sure.
And they knew that I was not only more than willing, but eagerly willing to teach that. I mean, at the moment at Florida State, I teach in the honors program. Now, in fact, it's good. It's only 16 students.
Oh, perfect.
But it's hands-on. There are assignments each week that I mark myself. Every week I mark 16, 500-word essays, and I do it, nobody else.
Mm-hmm.
And I always felt that way. And the good thing is, again, I think at Florida State, I'm not the only one. There's a couple of us do this, who are named professors, but who do that. And everybody is delighted that named professors would do things at that level. Whereas my colleagues are glad that they don't have to do it, because usually the courses you're doing are not just straight courses. They've got to be innovative. And a lot of people do that.
Yeah, well, that's really cool. That's really fun to hear. And I would agree myself, having taught a number of
Listen, they're not letting you get to. Go on.
Oh, no, I was just going to agree with you on the teaching. I've taught a number of undergraduates of varying ranks, and I think there is something exciting about teaching those first and second years.
I think so. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, I'm really curious about your transition from Guelph, where you've done, you developed and seem to have done a tremendous amount of work in the philosophy of biology, history of science, but then coming over to Florida State to really get ramping up there. If listeners don't know, you have a very big history and philosophy of science program there. And I've met several students. I remember when I was applying to graduate school who came from Florida State, and I think I even met some folks. I went over to the Ishkabibble conference. I think it was in Montpellier, France.
Right.
Yeah,
there, right?
Yeah. So I remember going, and there was a bunch of Florida State students there too.
Yeah, so that's right.
Yeah.
I'd like to do these summer trips, as I say. This year, I'm taking them all off to Flanders, to the battlefields of the First World War.
Oh.
2 years ago, we all went to Montreal. The year before that, we all went to England. I mean, we like to do these. We like to do these class trips.
Oh, that's phenomenal. Are you guys thinking about going to? Is it Rio this year? Or?
No, I don't. I'm not sure. I went to Sao Paulo. I've been to Sao Paulo.
Sao Paulo, yeah.
It's a attractive city.
Yeah.
If it were Paris or if it were Sydney, Australia, I might be thinking about it.
Yeah, it's fair. You got to pick and choose, I think, where you want to go. Yeah. So just a little again. Very quickly, how did coming over to Florida State and your decision to start this HPS program? How did that come about?
Well, I was just asked to do it. One of the provost, I think, had heard of me, and he wanted to do it. I mean, universities have changed since I started. I don't know. Again, of course, being in Canada is different from being in the States. Mm-hmm. But when I started, the administrators, by and large, were academics who came from the ranks, and most of them, not all of them, but most of them did not look upon this as a career move, but was something they might do for 5 years or 10 years. I mean, a lot of them had done it, they'd been chairs and then they'd gone on to be deans. Mm-hmm. Most of them expected, and in most cases it was the case, that the last 10 years of their life would be back in the department, in the classroom, and doing research. And so I feel that in those days, the administrators were much closer to the faculty and those things. Whereas today, people go into administration in the early 30s, they become associate deans. And of course, they're moving universities. Yeah. They're looking now to be dean somewhere else, and then, be vice provost or something, and provost. And I mean, they're on a ladder upwards. And I think the whole tenor of university life has changed in having what are de facto professional administrators. And so when I was offered to do this HPS program, I accepted to do it, but I didn't realize that by and large I wasn't being offered it because these were people who were desperately committed to it. These were people who saw it as a good thing to have for their own career.
Oh, geez. Oh, that's kind of disheartening.
I kept out of it that way. In the end, I found some non-decanal faculty who were very helpful, and we got it going, in the face of a lot of indifference. It really didn't help that Florida, is pretty Philistine. We were going to start a PhD program, and then it became clear we couldn't. And I'm kind of glad we never did, because, maybe you've got a job offer lined up. But, I see my friends even at places like Chicago or Wisconsin. Leave Indiana out of it, and how difficult it is to get their students placed.
Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah.
So it's not something I particularly want to spend my time doing. So, as I say, we don't have a PhD program, but at that level, it's worked. It's really worked very well. And it's been I've always felt that, in a way, it's not just the academic. It's the whole business of having some time to grow up a bit and to develop as a person. And I feel, without making it sound like an infant school, that having a program like this has been a very good thing, not just for me, but for the students, helping them to find their way. A lot of them say, I've done a couple of years, don't want to do it anymore, going to go into museum work, or I got one who's teaching at a private girls' school, and doing other sorts of things like that. And, that seems to be museums, of course, are a big place. That seems to be fine.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, as I mentioned, I remember when applying for graduate programs, I met some folks from Florida State. I think I met a gal who ended up going to UCL, I think, from after doing a master's there. Maybe this was several years ago, but yeah, no, I've heard some really good things.
Oh, yes, Elizabeth Dobson.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I hope she's doing well. I haven't heard or seen her for a while. I just remember that. And well, that's fantastic. So you've been at Florida State. Why don't you catch us up now that we've gone over quite a bit? Like what's going on currently with you or with the program?
Well, yeah, we're going over quite a bit, but we've missed an awful lot. But,
if there's anything you want to include as well, if there's something before we get to the current.
Right, let's backtrack a bit.
Sure.
So I went and I got to get a PhD. And so actually the man who became my supervisor back in Bristol said, well, nobody's done much work on biology.
Yep.
And why don't you, think about that? I joke that doing a degree, a dissertation in the philosophy of biology was an ideal thing because there wasn't much literature, and what there wasn't very good. And I'd never done biology in my life, but I started reading, John Maynard Smith's little book on the theory of evolution, and really loved it. And so I got very much into doing that and doing philosophy of biology. Well, of course, though, the other big thing by the end of the 60s was that Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was published in 62, but it took 5 years, let's say, to really get full momentum, as it were. And you look earlier, it was being picked up, but in the bigger centers. But by 67, 68, everybody knew about Thomas Kuhn's, and he was saying, if you're going to do the philosophy of science properly, you've got to do some history of science. And that certainly resonated with me. So I started reading the origin of species and stuff like that. And pretty soon it became clear to me that if I wanted to do this seriously, I had to get more training. So my first sabbatical wasn't doing a degree, but essentially I went to Cambridge in England. It was in the Wellcome Unit for the History of Medicine, where a man called Bob Young was there, and Martin Rudwick, the historian of geology, Lloyd Porter was a grad student at the time, and others. And I basically spent a year retooling as a historian of science, learning how to do it, archival work, those sorts of things. And that, as I say, became very important to me. I was saying to one of my students this morning, the laugh is philosophically, I'm quite conservative. I'm not a logical positive, logical empiricist, Hempel, Nagel. But historically, I'm really quite a constructivist. I'm not extreme constructivist, but Bob Young was a Marxist. And so I tend to, I tend to take the constructivist side very seriously. And if somebody said to me, well, you're a bright young student, did you know that you had let's say that, you had a father who left you and went on to have small wives and something like that. The first thing I'd be looking at is, why are you studying Freud rather than Copernicus, and that sort of thing. In other words, I'm always looking for people's background to see, what were their emotional links or things like that, which drove them one way or another, in that sort of sense. I mean, I was arguing actually the other day with a chap called Greg Raddick, you may know of, at Leeds, who's writing on William Bateson, the geneticist. And he said, well, Bateson, who was a bit of an outlier, went to Woods Hole for a couple of summers and worked with, I forget who it was. It wasn't Morgan, but it was somebody like that. And he said that his influence on him was tremendous, and that in fact he'd even looked after Bateson when he'd fallen sick and that sort of thing. And I said, well, Greg, as far as I'm concerned, I don't care. That explains Bateson's whole career. And Wilson, that's right, E.B. Wilson, the chap who wrote On the Cell. And I said, there's Bateson, a rather insecure young Englishman, and this, American prof. Not only puts him up in his house, but when he falls sick, Kate brings him, things in the bedroom and that sort of thing. And so, as I said, I'm very much a constructivist like that. And so I got into writing philosophy, history of science. But I realized at the same time, well, as I say, I realized after several years, I wrote the Darwinian Revolution, but I didn't want to be a historian of science in the sense of full time. I was really a philosopher. And then, of course, in the early 80s, the whole creationism movement blew up. And used, as biologists say, I was pre-adapted for that. I'd done philosophy of biology. I'd done a lot of history of evolutionary theory, all of these things. And although I'd not studied religion very much, I'd had a religious background. So, I wasn't unsympathetic to religion in the sense of ignorant of it. And so, I was asked to be involved in this. And as I say, we were talking about what makes for a successful academic. Well, one of the things, as I say, is hard work. Another, obviously, IQ, if you like, a knowledge, a nose for a topic, but also a willingness to, if something comes up, to drop everything and say, by God, I'm going to go at it. I got a colleague here in anthropology who works on brain science. And several years ago, I saw her do exactly the same. They discovered that little thing, The Hobbit. And, they asked her to do some studies on it. And I saw her. She dropped everything she was doing and worked on The Hobbit for a year and a half, and became one of the leading figures in the field. And I thought to myself, yeah, I see what's happening. She saw an opportunity and grabbed it. And I think that's something a lot of people are just not either willing or able to do. That, you've got to, if something comes up and there's a chance, you've got to be willing to say, am I going to, take a chance on this? And I was. So that was the early 80s. And so I got interested in science.
Yeah. So what things did you maybe take a chance on in maybe your career?
The other thing, of course, was the sociobiology debate was very big at that time. And I was one of the very few people who had a decent word to say for Ed Wilson. Everybody was going over to the side of Dick Lewontin and the Marxists and that. And I, coming from England, it had never seemed to, because I didn't grow up with the American Marxist, sort of influence of people like Lewontin or Gould or others like that. I was left wing, but I was never Marxist left wing. I mean, I describe myself as a Fabian socialist. I mean, in Canada, that's a very comfortable thing to be. You don't get a lot of Marxists in Canada, but you do get a lot of Fabian socialists and John Stuart Mill types. Sure. And so I was a bit of an outlier on that one because, you know, it didn't make me very popular in a lot of areas. I think one of the reasons why I never got a job offer elsewhere, well, it was mainly because I was very suspect. I mean, because women had taken up, it was now coming to be, and feminism was now becoming a big force in academia, and sociobiology was labeled as sexist. And so there were all of these sorts of things which were involved. And so I was very much an outlier. It didn't bother me. I mean, as I said, I'm a full professor in tenure. With tenure, it's a place I like to be. And I was just changing marriages and just entering into a happy new relationship. So I got other things in my life which, you know, which helped. You know, I got my Guggenheim, so I was able to say, well, Yahoo sucks, you know.
Yeah.
That's the time, though, where I did, you know, I wrote that little book called Taking Darwin Seriously.
Yep.
And I think that was interesting. I think it was at least partly being involved in the creationist movement. Even talking to some of the creationists themselves, and they'd say, well, Mike, we know where we stand, but we're never quite sure where you stand. You know, you're a Darwinian, and yet, you know, when we talk about ethics, you bring in the naturalistic fallacy, and, you know, what's your philosophical position? And blah, blah, blah. And then I again, Damascus experience, and I started to think, and I thought, you know, it's right. If I'm a Darwinian, it really ought to matter that I was, you know, modified mud rather than modified monkey, and or rather modified monkey rather than modified mud, and that, you know, I that was about the point where I became an evolutionary ethicist, evolutionary epistemologist.
Okay.
Boy, did I get sneered at because of that. Boy, Philip Pitcher, I think, wrote a review of my book.
Yeah.
No, not the Chronicle of Higher Education, in Times Higher Educational Supplement, which was a dilly.
Oh, yeah.
You know, for my 50th birthday, I collected all the bad reviews.
Yeah.
College, I said, welcome to 50 years of unqualified success. 54 years, and sent them to all my critics. And I'm very glad to say that my critics, including Philip Kitcher, saw the humor of that and sent very nice notes back, because, you know, it wasn't something that was going to get to me.
Oh, absolutely not. Well, I'm glad you can take the critics in the review and continue that working with the thin skin to heart as well.
I like to joke now. They call it the debunking argument. I say that people are being published in journals that would never criticizing me in journals that would never accept anything by me. And there's certain truth to that.
Well, that's great. That's great. Are there any other things as we kind of moved on? I mean, you've done, you've worked in history of evolutionary theory, a lot of different ideas in philosophy of biology. Is there a particular?
I talked about being interdisciplinary, and again, I think that's been terrific. And one of the last book I wrote was Darwinism as Religion, what the evolution is seen through literature, and that was very exciting because I wrote a book where I basically looked at the Darwinian revolution through people like Mrs. Gaskell, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Thomas Hardy, George Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, Dracula, Robert Louis Stevenson, and then on to Faulkner and John Steinbeck, and up to the present, Marilyn Robinson and Ian McEwan. And so I was looking at literature, as I say, the history of Darwinism through literature, which, I mean, I've always had a love of literature, so it wasn't something new. But at the same time, I had to do a lot of reading in it. Yeah. As I say, I hadn't looked at D.H. Lawrence since I was a teenager. Going back to D.H. Lawrence, I can't see one. But I found that very exciting to get involved in another discipline. I've always enjoyed immensely being able to move to biology, to history, to there's a certain amount of social science, not really.
Yeah.
Although I did do some work with an economist for a while there, but certainly in my own field, in obviously in religion, and then in English literature, I've always found it both stimulating and exciting. I think it was not Donald Campbell once said, to be interdisciplinary, you've got to be willing to be inadequate in many fields at the same time. And that's true. But that's okay. I mean, a lot of the kind of training that somebody like you gets, somebody is very much, narrow it down. Do your dissertation. Don't, I remember, was it Polly Windsor saying, well, I discourage students from doing biographies. Well, fuck it, I like biographies. I mean, that's interesting. I just did a biography of Martin Luther. And, I'm interested in, where did Luther come from? What happened? Why was he so violently anti-Semitic? I mean, I'm interested in individuals. And so I'm fortunate, as I say, become a full professor with tenure before you do what I say. But I've been fortunate like that. Being at lesser universities, Guelph and Florida State, also has been a good thing. It's given me a lot more freedom, I think, to do what I want to do, rather than what might be expected to do. I think somebody once told me the University of Michigan philosophy department had a thing outside the chair's door where they had all of the top journals ranked, and then if you got into one of these, your name was added as almost to these top journals. And I thought to myself, God, think of the pressure that a young person is under, that they've got to think not what I like to write, but can I write a paper that would be accepted by the Journal of Philosophy or by Phil Review? And think of how that restricts not only the style, but the topic. You're going to spend, what are you going to do? First thing you're going to do is spend an afternoon reading through the Journal of Philosophy the last 10 years to see what gets accepted. Oh, they never accept, let's say, something on Kant, historical.
Sure.
So don't do that. They never accept, so don't do that. I mean, well, it's very restricting on what you can do. As I say, one of the reasons I like to write books is because my books sell well enough that editors want to publish them. Mm-hmm. And that gives me a freedom. I mean, when I was 45, I found that I could get away from being refereed entirely. I could publish with Blackwell's or Routledge because my books would sell enough. They were pleased to publish. But I deliberately went to publishing with university presses like Harvard or Chicago. I hate being refereed. I'm a miserable person. But I felt that it gave me a certain integrity and a certain personal honesty in doing that sort of thing. So I don't want, freedom, not license, I think A.S. Neal, the avant-garde educator, used to say. And I think there's a lot to that. Freedom, not license. Freedom does not mean you can do what the hell you want to do. It doesn't at all. But it does mean, it means you're not constrained for the wrong reason.
I like that. Yeah, it's obvious. Yeah, it provides some constraints, but the constraints are more helpful than anything. Whereas certain constraints, like University of Michigan, it does not sound like a very, I don't want to make speculation about what it's like, but if I was an incoming assistant professor, I would be pretty intimidated. Seeing the rankings up there, that just sounds like not just intimidated, but boy, is that ever a message? Yeah. It's like, what do we care about? It's like it turns it into the job. It turns it into the caring less about the ideas and more about the prestige. Yeah. So,
how's that?
Yeah. So what do you, I suppose, now, we're almost caught up with things. Is there, when we're getting in a little bit toward the end, we've learned a lot about your story.
Yeah, well, if I don't hope so, I think others do.
No, this has been a phenomenal. No, this has been really great. Like, by the way, I really appreciate taking the time.
If I've got the same chair that I don't much care, I might go longer. Maybe when I'm 80, I'll turn around and say I'd like to have a sabbatical now.
Well, we'd love to have you back on, maybe at some time. Won't repeat. You've been a wonderful guest so far. But we new things will come up, maybe to talk about your new book or something. Would be fun. Well, is there anything you'd like to add or to say now as to the listeners, to new students, to anything about anything at all?
I'm just trying to think. I mean, no. I mean, as I say, I think Bernard Williams talks about moral luck, and I think I'm very morally lucky. I mean, in the sense, I've lived in. Although I was born during the war, I mean, I've lived in safe times. I talked about the importance of those early years of education after the Butler Act. I had those opportunities. I didn't have to go to work when I was 14. I've had good health. I mean, I've never lost a day's class because of illness. Although I once had root canal or something, and the Novocaine wore off in the middle of class. I don't say that I did very well all the time.
Sure.
But as I say, I had good jobs. I mean, obviously, you make of it what you get, and I mean, the people who are always complaining about departments are usually the people who are not particularly happy people.
Yeah.
If you think about the person who's always got a gripe about what's going on, or they're not getting their share or something, they're usually people who, frankly, are often not making the contribution either. So I feel like I've been able to do that. But so, as I say, I think I have been handed a huge amount of moral luck. And after 50 years of teaching and 50 years of books, I feel very much that I've used my talents. And
absolutely,
that I use them well. It's rather nice. I mean, here am I, and I sneer about, analytic philosophy. But it's really rather nice to have staked out this position on evolutionary ethics, which, as I say, everybody's busy refuting now. So what's my is to put together a Cambridge handbook on evolutionary ethics.
Yeah.
To keep my name in front of the public. And I'm happy to do that. But as I say, it's kind of fun to feel that I've been able to go full circle back to regular philosophy. And I've always been a regular philosopher. I'm not an analytic philosopher.
Yeah.
But I'm a regular philosopher. As I say, last year I taught a course on Kant. This fall, I teach a course on American philosophy, Jonathan Edwards to Richard Rorty. I mean, that's what I'd like to do. There's Lizzie. Come and say hi to this very nice young man.
Oh, it looks like we. Oh, hello. Hi, I'm Nick. Hi. Thanks.
I'm doing my best.
Yeah. He's been a very entertaining guest and a wonderful. He's been giving some great stories and some great advice to our listeners here. So,
where are you off to there? Okay, that's it. Anyhow, so there you go. How's that sound?
That sounds great. Well, Michael, I must say it's been a real pleasure talking with you. And
you ever seen Loretta Kirtger?
No, I don't believe so.
You're in the HBS department at Indiana.
Oh, you're at Noretta, right? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. We see her around. Sometimes she'll come to the colloquia. I think she's emeritus now, so we don't see her.
You tell Noretta that you'd really like to go skinny dipping with her.
Okay.
Skinny dipping with Noretta is like if you can't meet Jesus Christ, then skinny dipping with Noretta is a good second.
Okay, I will keep that in mind. I will keep that in mind. Well, have a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll be in touch soon. I'll let you know when the show's out. And yeah,
I've shut you up.
Yeah. No. This has been great. Yeah, and if I catch it, and if I see it,
Greta, what a real man I am. You get out there and you're so cowed. You say, and she's there. All woman. She's up forward. All right?
Okay, Mike. Well, thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.